Okay, everyone. Warmly welcome to this afternoon's seminar to be given by Michael Puett on the topic, Why Do Global History? Michael Puett is Walter Klein Professor of Chinese History and Anthropology at Harvard University. He received his Ph.D. in 1994 from the Department of Anthropology at the University of Chicago. We are honored and we are very happy to have him as non-resident long-term fellow at Scas and this semester in residence. Michael Puett's research interests are focused on the interrelations between history, anthropology, philosophy, and religion, with the hope of bringing the study of China into larger historical and comparative frameworks. He's also an important contributor to the re-examining of notions of modernity, global history, and the very idea of the axial age. His books include The Ambivalence of Creation, Debates Concerning Innovation and Artifice in Early China. This book was published by Stanford University Press in 2001. And in this book, he considers debates about the conditions under which it is acceptable for humans to create anew. Another well-known book of his is To Become a God, Cosmology, Sacrifice, and Self-Divinization in Early China, published in 2002. And in this book, he reconstructs long-running debates in early China about the proper relationship between humans and gods. He's also the co-author with Adam Seligman, Robert Weller, and Bennett Simon of the book Ritual and Its Consequences, an essay on the limits of sincerity, and this book was published by Oxford University Press in 2008. Michael Puett has published a large number of articles in academic journals. Among these are the recent article, Life, Domesticated and Undomesticated, Ghosts, Sacrifice, and the Efficacy of Ritual Practice in Early China. And this was published by the journal How, the Journal of Ethnographic Theory in 2019. Another article I'd like to mention here is Ritual and Ritual Obligations, Perspectives on Normativity from Classical China, and this was published in the Journal of Value Inquiry in 2015. Thirdly, let me mention to you the article Critical Approaches to Religion in China, published in Critical Research on Religion in 2013. Now, recognitions for Michael's outstanding work came very early. In 1995, he received the Mark Galler Prize for the best dissertation at the University of Chicago. And in 2016, Michael Puett was elected foreign member of the class for Humanities and for outstanding services to science of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. He was also appointed 2018 FAU ambassador at the Friedrich Alexander Universität Erlangen-Nürnberg. And he also serves on the academic community more, I should say, than most of us do. Among his many assignments of trust are having been the chair of the pre-1900 Joseph Levinson Prize Committee during 2010-2011. And this prize, I should say, is awarded to the English language books that make the greatest contribution to increasing our understanding of the history, culture, society, politics, or economy of China. He has also been president of the Society for the Study of Chinese Religions in the period 2005 to 2008. And while at Scas, he is completing a project on the rethinking of approaches to global history. And it is this very topic that we will hear him talk more about today. Very welcome, Michael.
Great, thank you so much, Christina, both for inviting me and for the much too nice introduction, but very deeply appreciated, and thanks to all of you for coming. Let me hereby welcome you, since we've just had the Chinese New Year, let me welcome you to year 73 of the Chinese Federation of All Under Heaven. Or, for those of you who still use the Western calendar, that outmoded calendar, welcome to year 2220. 200 years after those events that we all know had such a the beginnings of which had such a transformative effect on the world we are now, luckily for us, finally living within. My goal today will be twofold. I will both introduce you to the current state of the field of global history and give you a brief discussion of the history of that field, because as many of you know, that field actually began slightly before the moment I've just referred to. It actually began at the end of the 20th century, so slightly over that 200-year mark that I just mentioned. So I'll be saying a few words about the beginnings of the discipline that we are now practicing, discussing their sad misconceptions, and then, of course, placing that within a larger context. Let me emphasize why I want to do the latter. When I go through briefly the beginnings of our discipline of global history, it will be easy for us to laugh as we go about what people 200 years ago used to think. It's important for us, even as we laugh, however, to remember these were intelligent people who were arguing things for reasons they thought were meaningful and important. And so, therefore, I will also try to give you a context for understanding them, using their indigenous concepts, their attempts to understand the world from what we now, needless to say, see from they had a very limited perspective, and then, by placing it within a larger context, give an argument as to how we now properly understand the world. So to do this, let me begin very briefly with the beginnings of our discipline. The beginnings, as most of you know, meaning in the early 1990s, so slightly over 200 years ago. And let us briefly discuss what they, back then, used to mean by terms like global history and globalization, terms they used quite frequently and clearly thinking those were meaningful to them. So what were their views? Now, again, I want to forewarn you, when we go through this initial, very brief statement, we may laugh as we go, but thereafter, I will be pulling back and placing this within a much larger context. But first, let's talk about what they thought, mainly as a means of introducing some of their indigenous concepts. So, to do this, we'll go back a little bit earlier than the 1990s. We will look at the time where their concepts, their entire conceptual baggage came together, namely in the 19th century, in that area that we now know as Western Europe, and we'll discuss those views as they arose, and then how they came to define the field of global history beginning in the 1990s. So, as most of you know, and I'll therefore be brief in this, the conceptions, let's put it politely, that they had back then goes along the following lines. Those people back then in the 19th century, a vision completely accepted in the 1990s through 2020, was that somehow all of humans, throughout all of human history, had lived in things they called, and again I'll use the indigenous concepts here, a traditional world. A traditional world, they claimed, in which all positions of authority, political, social, cultural, economic, were defined by birth. You were either born an aristocrat or you were not, and even if you were born an aristocrat, what level of aristocracy you were born into would define your power, your status in life, everything. Also, they used to claim, in these so-called traditional societies, the poor people who lived within them, were told what to believe. So not only was your position in life defined by birth, but you were born into a worldview that would teach you what to do. You were forced to do things like rituals, right, that would socialize you into a way of thinking and a way of being in the world. that would define them. In other words, instead of being allowed to define themselves. And somehow all of humans, they thought, lived in these societies until, lo and behold, in the 19th century, in, yes, Western Europe, suddenly something they called, and again I want to introduce their indigenous terms, something they called modernity began. Let's not laugh too hard, but it's hard not to laugh a little bit. And the claim was that once this modernity began in the 19th century in this one little piece of the globe, once it began, humans for the first time ever began to determine for themselves how to live their lives. Because finally they realized that the single most important unit, in fact the only unit that really matters, is the individual. Each individual, of course, having a true self, a soul within, and that individual, once they finally realized that this was the proper way to understand the world, that individual should therefore have the power to determine for him or herself how to live. And so, for the first time in human history, they thought they were creating a world where those individuals, on their own merit, could, well, do what they wanted to do. They could, work hard. They could make money. They could, therefore, on their own efforts, become wealthy, gain incredible amounts of power. They also could choose for themselves what to believe. They had free choice, free will. And they could decide, do I want to believe in this, or do I want to decide to believe in that? They got rid of those silly things like rituals that told them what to do, because now they were free-willing individuals, and they could decide for themselves. They were modern, as opposed to all other humans who had ever lived, and of course, most importantly from what they used to think, all of those sad people throughout the world at the same time who hadn't yet become modern. Now, of course, as we know, all good things come with bad things, and so in this vision of the world, they thought, then the history of that period, the 19th century until, 1990s, or really 1989 is when they would give the defined date, that next period when humans could finally decide for themselves how to live their lives, well, of course, that's a tough decision. And so people, now for the first time allowed to think for themselves, they began coming up with different ideas about how to organize the world. So they, for the first time, since they could think for the first time, they began to think, should we organize our life this way or that way? And out of this comes this series of different political theories. For the first time, they thought, in human history, different political theories about how to organize the world. So, should we organize the world under capitalism, an ism, socialism, communism, fascism? And the argument was that the next 2 centuries basically see a series of wars, hot and cold, fought over these different isms. And then the reason the 1990s is so important, you may wonder, 1990s, but the reason it's so important for this narrative and for the entire beginnings of something called global history, as they defined it, the reason it's so important is in the 1990s, the claim was that period came to an end when? In 1989. Why? Because the Berlin Wall falls, and the claim was that brings to an end the war of the ideologies, the war of the isms that had been dominating the modern world, in other words, Europe and America, for 2 centuries. And you may have even heard, again, I want to give you the indigenous terminology to give you a sense of how they were thinking, a word or a phrase, I should even say, that was mentioned at the time to define this was called the end of history. Try not to laugh. We want to understand what they were thinking back then. So the end of history. The claim being that history, again, was the world of tradition, then it became modern, then again, the modern period consists of these wars of the different isms. The end of history was understood to occur in 1989 when the isms stop. Not because one power, that thing you might have remembered called the United States, not because they won, but because the proper view won. That after the wars of the isms, the proper view won the day, and that proper view was, surprise, surprise, capitalism as perfectly instantiated in the United States of America. But it just so happened to be the United States of America. The claim was that was the truth. Why? Because that was the economic system that allowed these free-willing individuals to make money. It was the system that allowed those free-willing individuals, particularly if they did make money, to have an incredible impact on the political world, because wealth gives you immediate access to political power. It represented the moment when finally the last remnants of socialism and communism, things like the welfare state and unions, etc., were finally eradicated. And finally, it was a world built by and for individuals, namely the successful individuals, but nonetheless, because they're the successful ones, they're the ones who could live up to the creed of individualism, and therefore, by definition, they should be the ones who gain great wealth, great power, and be able to define what was then called the market, the end of history. Now, you may be wondering why precisely at this moment, they also back then started talking about things like globalization and global history. Well, again, let's try not to laugh. We want to understand their way of thinking. They claimed it was the same thing, right? Because now that the end of history had been achieved, finally, this hyper-modern world, the proper modern world, perhaps we should even say, finally, that moment, having occurred, can now be spread throughout the world, finally. And all of those other places, those cultures stuck in the traditional world, they too could finally become modern as well. And so, this package, what was called the Washington Consensus, this package was going to be brought to the world. And now you would have free-willing individuals all over the world able to do what finally hyper-modern humans are allowed to do, which is to be free and be individuals and make money and gain immediate political access by doing so. And so the claim was it's an era of globalization where throughout the world this political economic package is being brought to the world to liberate them, those traditional people. And since the world is being liberated through this globalization effort, as they called it, it was also important to realize that, well, yes, I mean, to some extent, presumably even in these traditional cultures, you presumably must have seen hints of the proper way of understanding the world, and hence the beginnings of a discipline called global history. Now, we want to understand what they meant by these terms. What they meant by the term was the following. We don't want to simply say that, again, things like modernity, capitalism, etc., are being brought to the world because at the time the dominant power happened to be the United States of America. The claim was, no, this is part of a teleological progression toward the final state of modernity. As such, all of the world should be seen as having some march toward this final goal. Now, not as much as the West, obviously. Clearly, they wouldn't want to go that far, but everyone else had a part to play. And so, just to give you a sense of this field of global history as it begins to develop, the argument goes along the following lines. Let's not simply talk about modernity. Let's talk about the rise of something called early modernity that begins earlier, by definition. And what defines early modernity? It's the beginnings of the breakdown of the traditional world, which it turns out we can find hints of throughout all of Eurasia. To give an important example, based on the world that we are finally, luckily for us, living within, China was seen as playing a crucial role in this. Why? Because China had huge, massive trade networks that begin, actually quite early, but according to the narrative at the time, that really start going in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. And insofar as they had trade networks, they presumably had markets. And insofar as they had markets, they presumably had the beginnings of individualistic thinking. And so therefore, if we go into places like China, we can find the beginnings of an early modern world as well. So it's not simply that modernity is, well, a code name for European and American imperialism. No, not at all. It was actually the development of a set of global processes, early modernity. And then, of course, modernity itself should be understood as occurring multiply, in the sense that it's coming out of different early modern traditions, and therefore you see modernity springing up independently in different places around the world. And so you look for examples of this occurring, and hence you get a global history that, of course, would not in any manner, shape, or form question the terms of the time, but would be showing them to be part of a larger global development. And therefore, you get to that moment. Let's not even go quite as late as 2020 yet. We'll come back to that very important year, as we know. Let's say by 5 years before that, 6 years before that, you really had a consensus view of a globalizing world with a global history that showed this globalizing world, and a vision of modernity that was, they thought, no longer defined by ethnocentric terminology, but in fact was truly encompassing the globe, and hence the name. Now, I said we're going to try to go through this without laughing too much, but it's not easy to do, particularly since we know what's going to happen later. But what I would like to do now is to try to contextualize them, because it's easy to laugh at them based upon what we do know is going to begin happening after 2020. So let me begin instead by contextualizing them so we can understand why they would have thought the things they thought, why these indigenous terms would have made sense to them, and maybe we can even learn some lessons for our own day when we are clearly living in a very different vision with very different indigenous concepts that we'll be getting to later as well, but perhaps there's a bit of self-reflection that we can learn from this very sad period of human history. So let me now give a larger rereading of global history. I'll be brief, since of course most of this you know from your textbooks, but I do want to pick up a few key themes that will help to contextualize that sad period of human history of the 19th, 20th, and early 21st centuries. So let me now quickly take you through global history as we now properly, of course, understand it. Now, let's begin with that concept that we correctly laugh at now, but it didn't arise out of nowhere, these so-called traditional societies. Now, as we know, that is a very, very dangerous concept, and we'll discuss momentarily when and why it emerged as it did. But it's important to note it wasn't painting out of nowhere. Were there societies in human history that worked this way? Well, yes. And to give an obvious example, one that I'll be coming back to, in terms of the political system, a ranked system, in which all positions of power, political power, social status, etc., were defined by birth, and in which your birth would define literally your social status, your power, the amount of land you held or lack thereof. Did societies like this exist? Well, sure. People in the 19th century didn't make this up. What were they looking at? The 18th century in Europe. That's what they were looking at. It was a society that was exactly that. And is it true that that existed throughout the rest of the world, and therefore the rest of the world should be characterized as traditional? Well, obviously not. And we'll come back to chillingly how they could have imagined such a thing. But the question I want to raise now is, what happened to Europe that led them to be so far behind the rest of the world as we now properly understand it? Such that in the 19th century, it would seem radical, stunning, surprising to people that all positions of power and status wouldn't be defined by birth. This seemingly heroic moment in 19th century Europe that struck them as new? So let's recapitulate a little bit of what we now know about human history. And I want to emphasize strongly, I don't mean to be too critical of them, but I'm not going to mention here a single empirical fact that was not perfectly well known to any historian back then in, say, 2020. They simply had concepts that didn't allow them to talk about what I'm about to mention. So, let's talk about briefly how we now understand the world. Were there such societies that they would have called traditional? Well, yes, we've just mentioned one, and there were, of course, many, many others. But let me begin my story at a not minorly crucial point in this larger history. By the time you move into midway through the first millennium BCE, you see a series of attempts to completely break down what had been, we now call them, Bronze Age societies, which were, of course, ranked societies where positions of power were defined by birth. Another of those times in human history when that was indeed the case. Over the course of the first millennium BCE, every single one of these Bronze Age kingdoms throughout all of Eurasia broke down, every single one of them. Every single one of them we now know broke down under very similar circumstances. We have now been able to trace all of the technologies, looking now at Eurasia in specifics, all of the technologies that were spreading across Eurasia. We have looked at all of the social developments, which we now correctly see to be pan-Eurasian developments. We have seen very clearly the breakdown occurring roughly the same time of all of these Bronze Age kingdoms. We have seen over the subsequent centuries attempts to begin rebuilding societies. We have also seen the emergence of a huge number of religious movements, some of them extremely radical, many of which explicitly involved attempts to rethink human social relations and very explicitly arguing against societies based upon positions of power, based upon heredity. We also know that coming out of this period, by the last couple of centuries before what, going back to that old Western calendar, would have been known as the period of before Jesus Christ, BCE, we also know, if we're going to use that calendar for a moment, that in those last couple of centuries, a series of empires began emerging across all of Eurasia, but focusing now momentarily on the agricultural areas, that begin picking up on various pieces of these earlier religious movements. And we also know that the types of imperial state systems that start being created, almost all of them involved attempts to begin trying to create some form of meritocracy. We also know, living in the world that we now live in, that by far the most extreme example of this is, of course, the eastern end of Eurasia, China, which, as we now know, being year 73 again of the Chinese Federated Union of all under heaven, is the beginning of the world that we will now be living in. But even in that other place, the western end of Eurasia, even there were some minimal nascent attempts at doing this. Minimal. We also know the larger history. Those empires continue in various forms throughout all of Eurasia, including pretty far westward too. The Roman Empire we now know, and it's important to emphasize this because they actually didn't think this back 200 years ago. They used to say, you're lucky you're sitting down for this, they used to claim that the Roman Empire, I'm sure you remember that one from the textbooks, the Roman Empire fell, and then that was it for empire in Europe. They really thought that. That was in their textbooks. In fact, we've done historical studies of the textbooks children were raised in. That was said in every single textbook. Obviously, you luckily have been raised in correct textbooks, which will all say, no, the Roman Empire continued. It was called in that historiography the Byzantine Empire to make it clear that something radically weird and different. No, it's the Roman Empire. They called itself the Roman Empire, and it lasted for another millennium. And if you go across Eurasia, this continues. In other words, the weird one out in all of this, if you look across Eurasia, is that weird stuff out there in the far western end of Eurasia, the far, far western end of Eurasia, where, in fact, significant forms of state power continued to decline, where, in fact, indeed, many of the ideologies continued to actively support hereditary rule. That's completely true, and that continues. And from that vantage point, the assumption was this must, of course, be continuing elsewhere too. Well, we know the history of this, and I'll therefore be brief and recount it. Obviously, that's absurd. And let me just skip several centuries and get to this key moment that was being called back then early modernity. So we, of course, now understand what was going on, and let me lay this out. And of course, now, properly speaking, I will be turning to the eastern part of Eurasia for obvious reasons based upon the world that luckily we now live in. So, as we know, by the time you start moving into 13th, 14th centuries, in the far eastern end of Eurasia, in the area that we now call China, in that area, you now have strong centralized state bureaucracies in which all positions of power in the bureaucracy, all of them, are only obtainable by taking a civil service exam. That civil service exam is, by definition, only conceivably passable by an extraordinary educated elite. But an educated elite, the exams are open to anyone from any ethnicity, so someone born in Korea, as long as they learn the classical language, it was called classical Chinese, but I mean, at the time it was just simply the classical language, can take the exam and move into the bureaucracy, which certainly happened. And was this a type of meritocracy? Well, as we now know, of course it was, of a certain type that's going to be very historically important. Once you get this going, the ideology of the time was the following. What you want to do is to create as much of a divorce as possible between political power and economic power. That's the explicit goal worked out in the political theories. Your goal is to have political power, I should say, controlled by an educated elite. That is a form of meritocracy in which you become educated, highly educated, incredibly well educated. Hopefully, by being educated, you are breaking down your tendencies that I'll get to momentarily as a human being that limit your perspectives. And if you can achieve this, you hopefully will therefore be an educated elite who will run the political system and who therefore will owe your position in power exclusively to that education. Why is this important? Because, well, let's get back to those things called the trade routes that back then in the around 2020, the global historians correctly like to talk a lot about. Well, we now, of course, I would even say we know more about them. Actually, we don't know anything more about them than we didn't perfectly well, they didn't know perfectly well then, but we can certainly talk about them in slightly different ways. So, did you have trade routes throughout Eurasia? Of course. And they were huge, massive. And was the state trying to stop them? Of course not. The goal was the divorce. The key being the following. If you are creating meritocratic bureaucracies based upon an educated elite, the goal is, again, divorce that power from any kind of an elite who owes their position of power through wealth, however obtained. Early on, first millennium BCE, those political theories were arguing against, of course, an aristocratic hereditary elite. The idea being, if an hereditary elite controls resources, how do we create a state that can cut against and across aristocratic interests that can, for example, build infrastructure, roads, bridges, that can actually build a workable state? And the only way to do it, again, is to create a meritocratic bureaucracy based upon an educated elite. So even if you're born into positions of power, that will not in itself give you access to political power. You must still become educated and work your way up through a radically different system. And once you start moving into what they back then 200 years ago called the early modern world, when you indeed are getting these extraordinary trade networks developing, what, well, we now know, but obviously they should have known perfectly well back then too, it's coming out of the same view. Because once you have states that are doing this, building massive infrastructure that cut across aristocratic local interests, that act in itself, it turns out, surprise, surprise, is extraordinarily conducive to merchant activity. That's a key part of why you get these massive trade routes that begin developing over what they, 200 years ago, thought to be these transformative set of centuries. Huge trade networks begin developing. These networks are largely based upon temple networks that spread hundreds, thousands of miles. They continue to grow through what we now will think of as the Chinese Empire, but they grow and expand to include much of what we now will call South China, throughout all of Southeast Asia. They are connecting to huge trade networks, developing through Africa, what we now call the Middle East, South Asia, a huge world of trade networks. And on the eastern end of Eurasia, this is a part and parcel of the types of meritocratic institutions the state is building. And why is this so crucial? I mean, why am I emphasizing the interlinkage between the two? Because the key being that, number one, as we've just seen, once you have a state that can cut across aristocratic interests, you start allowing the possibility of these markets to develop. But equally important is step number two in the process. As the trade networks begin developing and people start becoming extraordinarily wealthy, in other words, not gaining wealth through heredity, but also now gaining it through the market, again, that in itself gives you no access to political power. The goal is the divorce. You would still have to have your children be educated, take a civil service exam, socialized into a very different system. Once they're in the bureaucracy, they're physically moved around on a regular basis to prevent them from becoming connected to any one network, the goal being the divorce. And that world, it turns out, we now know, and they should have known this 200 years ago, was extraordinarily productive for the development of what they mistakenly used to call the modern world. And that's where I want to turn now as to why they could have been so mistaken. As we now know, what really is going on is the following. All of what I've been speaking about is focused, based upon the world we luckily now live in, on the far eastern end of Eurasia, China, but very comparable things are going on throughout all of Eurasia, with one little itsy-bitsy exception. In that far western end of Eurasia, they're not building these sorts of meritocratic institutions. They also, by the way, have almost no access to these trade routes because, indeed, the world is controlled by aristocratic hereditary interests with their own customs, their own laws. There's no state-building infrastructure across these areas. There's no significant state to speak of, period. And when the rulers, which again are first among equals of an hereditary elite, begin finally seeing these trade networks developing, and seeing those few places that for geographical luck have access to this incredible wealth that's being developed through these massive trade networks taking over all of Eurasia, things like, for example, Venice, which for geographical reasons gains access to it and suddenly creates an extraordinarily wealthy Venetian empire. But what about those places at the very, very far end of Western Eurasia? Spain, England, the Netherlands. I mean, places that have, geographically speaking, no access to these trade networks. Well, we know what they finally begin to realize they need to start doing. They need to start taking technology, ship technology that was developed obviously in the parts of Eurasia that have these trade networks, and they need to start trying to build ships. It's not the market that's building ships, it's the rulers, the hereditary elite, that are building ships for one goal. They're trying to gain access to the trade routes. That's the goal. That's the simple, straightforward goal. And as we know, they start trying to go around Africa, which they succeed in doing, but it's super expensive. They then try to say, okay, let's try to circumnavigate the globe, and they try that. And then the beginnings of the horrors that we know begin occurring. They hit, of course, the Americas. They begin creating out of that the grotesque form of what they called market capitalism, but let's call it for what it is, genocidal slavery. And they wipe out most of the indigenous population of the Americas. They use a slave system with Africans to work this land. They create, indeed, a radically new, we'll give them that, at least it's new, radically new form of economic state capitalism that indeed is, surprise, surprise, extraordinarily wealth-producing for the states in question. The states finally begin creating administrative states, but now with tremendous amounts of wealth created through the slave system. And while doing that, they had one goal in mind, which intriguingly was very explicit. It's in the sources, even though no one talks about this in among the global historians of the 2020, go back to 2020. What do they do with this wealth and power? It's the same goal they had had for a long time. Move into Asia and get control of the trade routes. And now they can. They use this incredible military power they have developed now for a century of slave ownership to move into Asia and take over the trade networks. Now they're not trading with the trade networks. The goal is to take over the nodes of the trade networks and make them into colonies. You create them as colonies, and you create it within the same large-scale system of what by now they're calling capitalism, which again, we can simply call a state form of slave capitalism. This becomes the economic drive of this grotesque period of human history in which this area of the land, Europe, and now, of course, the Americas too, come to dominate the world. Now, of course, is also the moment when they start claiming, this is modernity. We're liberating the world. We, of course, now know that that hyper moment in the 1990s that will continue for 3 decades is, of course, a continuation of this, now being led by America, the new superpower. And we do know sadly, what is to happen in that world. That world does finally come to an end, but as we know, it is not a happy ending. That world comes to an end in which, as we know, extraordinary levels of income inequality lead to the emergence, again, this happened once before in the 1930s, and they thought, well, let's just do it again, and it'll work out well this time. It leads to the emergence of extraordinary authoritarian movements. These authoritarian movements, of course, start battling over a growingly limited number of resources created through this capitalist system that has now devastated much of the globe. We know the extraordinary types of wars that then start ensuing. They used to call it World War III. As we know, it's really a century of just horrific resource-driven wars among these authoritarian movements. Luckily, we'll go over that quickly, because luckily we know that, on the contrary, finally, as that world, through horrible means, is finally destroyed, other visions finally begin taking power. Other visions that would argue, actually, what happens if you recreate that divorce? What happens if you don't have, to throw out a not random example, every single one of your theories of the social sciences developed in the heartland of this, Western Europe in the 19th century, continued and institutionalized, particularly in a field known as economics that comes to dominate the 1990s and those next 3 decades, that takes for granted that vision I have just mentioned, the modernity vision, individuals as having free wills. The only way to organize a world is one in which those free-willing individuals are taken out of their context and somehow claimed to be free to do whatever they want, which, as we know, just means a very tiny, limited number is given extraordinary amounts of wealth and power. What happens when that world, with those ideologies, are finally seen for what they are? And once we finally began to look at other visions of the self, other visions of political theory, of economic theory, of social theory, that have arisen, that were arising, I should say, throughout the entire world, when finally they began to be taken seriously, we finally began the moment of realizing, yes, humans have been struggling for millennia to build different worlds. No perfect system has been created yet. I'll come back to that momentarily. But out of those struggles, you can see the complexity of different ways of doing it, the strengths and dangers of trying to build it one way versus another way. You can actually look at these millennia of different attempts to build political systems, to build markets, to rethink both the political system and a market, and you have millennia of work, both theoretical and practical, to build upon. A world that in that horrible period of human history was not only being discussed, you actually had entire academic disciplines defined around the modernity project that by definition meant no idea, no theory that ever arose in anywhere else in the world could ever be taken seriously, because by definition they were traditional and therefore should never be thought of as theory and be thought of as something we can learn from. But let me conclude with a question that I'm sure all of you have. I mentioned at the beginning we should learn something from this sad period of human history, and let's turn to that openly. You might, understandably, plausibly, I'm going to even say correctly, wonder, are we not falling into what they fell into? Is it not possible that in this even very brief recounting, I am emphasizing a series of ideas that have come into an imperial power that now dominates the world? And am I not now focusing on some ideas at the expense of others that have arisen throughout all of human history? Of course I am. And therefore, let me just go back to that key period, 200 years ago. Let's call it 2020, a period that we know is the beginning of what sadly is going to occur over the next century. What if they had done it differently? What if, instead of allowing that imperial world to die grossly as it was to die over the next century, and simply allow another imperial power with another set of theories to come to dominate the academic and intellectual world, suppose they had actually, well, lived up to their own terms. Suppose they had really tried to think in global ways, because that access to everything I've just mentioned. Suppose they had actually begun the work at what we now know in retrospect to have been a crucial moment of really looking at theories that arose from around the world. Some great ones arose from what they were calling the West, of course, but what if they had allowed people to learn and think through other ones? What if, in the grand economic and political theories that were being taught in schools, they were teaching those from around the world too? And what would have happened if perhaps at that crucial moment, by definition, they would have questioned the political theories of the nation state, the political theories of capitalism, but yes, the political theories of empire. And could that have staved off that next century? Maybe. And could it have staved off the end point of that next century where, yes, simply another empire has arisen, where yet again we take ideas that arose in our area as the truth? Could they have avoided that? Could maybe they have begun the work of creating a truly cosmopolitan world of thinking at that crucial moment when finally they certainly had access to everything I've just mentioned? And would we be standing here looking at the sad history of the past 2 centuries? I think the answer is no, we wouldn't. But they didn't, and therefore here we are under yet another empire. And let's hope maybe we won't be as destructive as what they did 2 centuries ago. Thank you so much.